It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Manpreet Kaur Kalra. I am an anti-racism educator, a social impact advisor, and activist. I've been currently working a lot on the farmers' protest, and that's been my area of focus over the last few months. I'm also on the board of the New York City Fair Trade Coalition, so it's really an honor to be able to bring the farmers' protest conversation to all of you using this platform. This was something that honestly came together pretty last minute. So I hope you're able to take away some new tidbits of information through our time today together. My hope with this, just so everyone knows, for this conversation today, I'm really going to be focused on really deconstructing different aspects of the Green Revolution, what the farmers' protest is, why people are protesting the new farming bills. I will be asking questions along the way. Please feel free to use the chat. I'm going to go ahead and start talking a little bit about the different aspects of the farmers' protest. If any of you have attended my past workshops or webinars, you'll know that I talk a lot about power dynamics, and the role of dismantling power when talking about anti-racism, especially when we're talking about social impact and global development. Oftentimes, by the nature, we're doing this presentation under the umbrella of the New York City Fair Trade Coalition. So I do want to speak to fair trade a bit as well. Oftentimes we use fair trade as a tool for global and economic development, but it's important to understand that there's a lot of layers of complexities when addressing issues around economic development in countries that have been colonized. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about the role of colonialism and how it continues to really manifest through what we're seeing has become a very serious issue around nationalism in India. So let's get started. I think one of the first things that's really important for us to recognize is that when we are talking about building more justice-oriented systems and economies, we have to think about sustainability. And sustainability is extremely important because you cannot have justice without first dismantling all the inequities that exist, right? Once you dismantle some of these inequities, you can really start rebuilding and thinking more about how you continue to rebuild for a more sustainable and just economy. Oftentimes, some of the inequities that we see in any given society, that doesn't just mean societies of the global south, we see this in the global north as well, is economic inequities, social, environmental, religio-political. Oftentimes that last one, the religio-political one's really interesting because we also see this in the lens of racial. We see many forms of different inequities that exist. And when I'm talking about India, I think that it's really important to recognize that inequities in any community are really baked into the fabric of how that community has come to exist. And a lot of the history that makes up how we navigate as members of any given community influences how we interact with each other. Understanding how these inequities intersect and really reinforce each other is really an important part when we talk about intersectionality, right? Intersectionality is essentially this idea of looking at how different advantages and disadvantages compound on themselves and create obstacles for individuals. And we're going to talk a little bit more about intersectionality and different forms of inequities, especially in the lens of India, a little later on. But I think really understanding this is important because when we talk about the farmers' protest, we realize that a lot of the aspects that are influencing why farmers are protesting fall into these buckets. We have issues around economic injustice, social injustice, environmental and climate injustice, food inequities. We have religio-political injustice, right? So we have all of these aspects, and they are extremely nuanced in many ways. And we realize that these aspects of injustice are only further reinforced by systems of power, right? So one of the things I think is really important is we often hear the phrase anti-racism being thrown around, right? But to be anti-racist, we have to understand that anti-racism means addressing power. It means dismantling power. It means addressing ways in which we see power in the systems, policies, and attitudes of any given society. And so when we talk about the farmers' protest, when we talk about even Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, we have to recognize that no issue is just what you see on the surface. There are layers and layers of complexities that really influence and inform the issues that we are trying to navigate. And so I think that it's important to recognize this because I do want to acknowledge where I come from when I talk about the farmers' protest. One of the things I've talked a lot about, and it's important to me, is recognizing our own biases, our own privilege, our own lens when we are having any conversation. I recognize that when I talk about the farmers' protest, I am talking about the problems affecting my community, a community I've identified with, a community that shapes my identity. So yes, there will be times where I will also have my blind spots, but I work really hard to make sure that I am being honest and being thoughtful about how I approach and recognize spaces in which I feel that maybe I am being skewed by the fact that this is such a personal topic. But I will say that when it does come to the farmers' protest, the issues that we are seeing are truly at their core a human rights issue. They are about land rights, they're about human rights, and they're really, at the end of the day, about food justice. And so for us to be able to recognize these core principles that are influencing the farmers' protest is absolutely critical, because even though we have our own internal biases, there's certain things that we know as humans are just not okay. So let me talk a little bit more about the bills themselves. So let's break down the three new bills. Essentially, what we saw when it comes to the farmers' protests is earlier in 2020, it's 2021, just following along. Earlier in 2020, Prime Minister Modi in India decided to pass three new bills that essentially allow for the deregulation and privatization of India's agricultural industry. Right. And now these bills are really interesting because what they essentially allow for is for bigger companies, private held companies, to come in and undercut farmers, right? So what we see is you saw the dismantling of a minimum support price for crops, which is essentially kind of what we considered our like pseudo subsidies, right? Removing restrictions on the purchase of land by corporations, and then removing limits on stockpiling commodities. So that last one, each of these is really important. The first one in particular is one of the big issues that we see, but I think that last one, as all of us who are thinking about really justice, is important to recognize, right? So what happens when you are removing limits on stockpiling of commodities is that you're allowing for private businesses to essentially regulate the price of the pricing of crops in the general market, right? So you can essentially pull back on access to wheat and rice and create this huge need for wheat and rice, which, when we know as people who, from a business lens, when there is a huge need, you're able to jack the price up because people need that product. They're willing to pay more for a product that is really hard to get their hands on. So what you see with the stockpiling of commodities is basically now corporations can control pricing of agricultural resources, which doesn't just affect farmers. This is the most important thing. This is not affecting just farmers. This is also going to ultimately affect the people of India. Okay, because now all of a sudden, the average person is going to have to pay more in order for their wheat and rice because we've created the ability for a scarcity. Okay. The other aspect of this, which is why the farmers are able to be undercut, because they will essentially have to sell to whatever price the big players are asking for. And they might sell something for what is 1/10 of what the product gets sold for in the market. And we know as fair traders that that is not fair. The other thing is dismantling minimum support prices for crops. All right. So this is really, really important. And the MSP, the minimum support price, is something that's extremely debated. And there is a lot more nuance around these. And there's some resources that I'm going to share with you so you can get more understanding of some of these aspects. But essentially, when it comes to the dismantling of a minimum support price, what you're doing is you're basically telling people that they no longer are guaranteed any minimum price for any of their crops. And already the MSP was kind of a problem because the MSP, while it was supposed to be available for over 20 crops, was actually in effect only for wheat and paddy. So that is one of the big things that we have to come to terms with, is this system that the farmers are protesting to preserve was already really harmful for them. So you can just imagine how horrendous these three new bills are to their livelihoods. So when we think about, most quote unquote developed countries, right, that have this idea of a free market system, we have to recognize that farmers have protections, right? There's farm subsidies. And I want to take a moment to recognize that farm subsidies still, even in the United States, mostly benefit larger farms. They don't necessarily benefit small farmers. However, at the end of the day, they still do exist, which is kind of how we have to think about the MSP when it comes to India's small farmers, right? So at the end of the day, what we're seeing with these three new bills is that they're going to allow for the privatization of agriculture, essentially undercutting small farmers who are already under layers and layers of debt due to other aspects that we will talk about shortly, and basically pricing them out of the market. And what's going to happen for many of these small farmers is that they're not going to be able to compete. They're going to end up losing their land because they're going to have such a high debt with not enough profit to pay for that debt. And part of that is by the nature of how agriculture is being practiced in India. And we're going to talk more about the Green Revolution just shortly. But I think it's important that we first recognize the fact that these bills are problematic. These bills are effectively turning India's agricultural system into some of the issues that we see with agriculture in the United States, right? So, corn in the United States is probably one of the most highly produced crops. And there's a lot of issues around that, right? Like the issue with a lot of these systems and the way that farming and agribusiness have developed is that we are really taking power away from communities and putting that power into the corporations. And as anyone who can be an advocate for fair trade, we recognize the importance that the power should be within the communities. When we talk about sustainable development, we have to talk about how communities can sustain themselves, not how communities can sustain other populations. We need to talk about how communities sustain themselves. So I want to take a moment to step back and really touch upon this idea of generational trauma and how it is impacting the story of what we're seeing with the farmers' protest, right? So the farmers' protest is actually the largest protest in human history. The numbers have been mixed, but we can say for a fact that it has been reported by multiple sources that it is the largest protest in human history. Okay. The issue with the farmers' protest is there's a lot of misinformation out there, which is why I think webinars such as this are so important, is that we have to be able to find different sources to be able to get information. So the thing about, I'm going to talk a little bit about the story of Punjab's farmers. And the reason I'm choosing Punjab in particular is a few reasons. One is Punjab is one of the regions that is most dependent on agriculture. Punjab is a state of India, and Punjab and Haryana, a neighboring state, used to be part of what was considered the larger state of Punjab. Now, this is where the conversation around colonialism becomes really important. So when the English basically colonized India, as they were leaving India, they broke up Punjab into what is between India and Pakistan. So Pakistan is actually a big portion of what used to be a single state of Punjab. That single state of Punjab was actually considered to be the homeland of the Sikh religious community, which is a marginalized religious community in India. So you basically take the homeland of a already marginalized religion, you break it apart, and then as we see moving forward in, so what was first, I think you can see my cursor. So when the partition happened, we saw a division take place, and this part became part of India, and what is green became what is now Pakistan, present day Pakistan. Now, what is Punjab currently is purely this purple that you see in the middle of the map. All right. And then you see Himachal Pradesh, which is also used to be part of Punjab. And then you see Haryana, which also used to be part of Punjab in the blue. The issue of why these further partitions happened was very much tied to the precursor for Green Revolution and the effects of Green Revolution. Punjab is known for its 5 rivers. Punj means 5, Ab means rivers. And so Punjab used to be the land of 5 rivers. Of course, that got completely broken apart when the partition happened as the British left, and then further broken apart as Punjab got further divided as into 3 states instead of 1. And what happened is Punjab's partition during the 1940s led to the largest migration in human history, right? So we've seen we have to understand that India has a huge population, right? So we saw the largest, bloodiest migration in human history, forced migration in human history take place when Punjab was divided into 2. And that partition, so my family was on what is now Pakistan, the side of what is now Pakistan, was essentially this idea of forcing people on the basis of religion to either side. So if you were Sikh or Hindu, you had to go into India. And if you were Muslim, you were forced into Pakistan. And so you had people on both sides that communities that coexisted, essentially got divided on the basis of religious lines. Okay, so we see one one moment of trauma in Punjab's history. Okay. You've lost all your land, you've been pushed out, and you've been told to go into a whole another part of a different country, okay? So now you are in India, and these are people who had farmland, they were farmers, and they were basically displaced and moved into India side of Punjab. And now in the 1960s, we have the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was essentially this idea of how do we make India self-sustaining and not dependent on other countries for its produce? Well, we're going to do a test run in Punjab because Punjab is a highly agricultural state. It is one of the only, when we talk about the farmers' protest, Punjab is a huge part of that conversation because Punjab and Haryana are the two states that are primarily dependent on agriculture to sustain themselves. Those are two states with communities that are primarily dependent on agriculture. Okay, so we've got the Green Revolution that happens, which essentially really strips apart traditional farming methods and replaces them with these new methods. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then you fast forward to 1984, where we had the Sikh genocide take place in India. And we can see that what we're experiencing now is compounding generational trauma for many of these farmers, right? They first had to rebuild their farms. They then had to relearn farming to fit into what was a government sanctioned form of, or government endorsed form or forced form of farming. And then we had to deal with a generation of community members basically being murdered. And so we're seeing this farmers' protest. You cannot begin to understand what is going on with the farmers' protest without recognizing that the people who are protesting have seen trauma for years and years. And this is almost that final straw where you took away our land, you took away our ways of sustaining ourselves, you took away our people, and now you want to put that final nail in our coffin. And that's the sentiment that's really driving the farmers' protest. So when we talk about human rights, and I think it's important to recognize, I put this up today, and I think it's a really important thing to talk about, is India has a history of human rights violations. Just on this day, February 23rd, if we go back in history, we see there was a mass rape incident that took place in 1991 in Kashmir. We see just a year ago, the Delhi massacre take place in 2020. And what we're seeing right now with the farmers' protest is that dissent is being silenced, right? So we have farmers that are protesting these very oppressive agricultural bills, and they are being met with police brutality, something all of us recognize very much exists, right? We know that it exists in the United States. We know it exists wherever there is power, right? Again, the conversation has to come back to power. Who has power and who does not have power? And so when we talk about human rights violations in India, right? Like, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that this idea of genocide has been normalized. This idea of massacres, these ideas of using different ways to silence dissent is constant. And we're seeing human rights being violated throughout the narratives when it comes to the farmers' protest, right? So the farmers' protest essentially started as a very peaceful, and is a very peaceful protest to challenge these laws that are being forced on India's small farmers and farm workers. However, the government has responded with human rights violations. We've seen climate activists get incarcerated. We've seen labor rights activists being held in jail for over 2 months or over a month. We've seen people be disappeared. We've seen people in their 80s getting really beat by police officers. We've seen water cannons. We've seen India has cut off their internet access to farmers' protest sites. We've seen a cutoff of water supply. We've also seen a cutoff of restrooms, access to restrooms. These are all human rights that are being violated, all in the name of silencing dissent. And the reality and the reason I think this slide is just so important is to recognize that none of what we are seeing is new. If you are a minority in India, or if you belong to a marginalized community in India, this is the reality of your rights as a human, right? They are as easily taken away. And you need to, I think for us, we need to recognize the importance of why are we not recognizing that this is a systemic issue? How do we address systems issues? And so recognizing these different aspects and complexities of the farmers' protest is just so critical. So I want to talk now about the Green Revolution. And just as a clue, it was not in India. The Green Revolution did not start in India. So the Green Revolution began in Mexico in the 1940s, which was 20 years before the Green Revolution arrived in India. And it was led by an American scientist named Norman Borlaug. And I think that it's very important to recognize the role of the United States in the Green Revolution, because we've essentially been exporting our understanding of how agriculture should be, how different economies should be operating. But essentially, Norman Borlaug is interesting. He actually has won a Nobel Prize for his work with what is the high yielding seeds. And essentially what he did was he created this new strain of wheat called dwarf wheat, and it increased in crop production. So dwarf wheat essentially allowed for us to have an increase in crop production, which essentially the idea of the Green Revolution was to counter the famine. So instead of having mass famine, we have more production of produce or crops. We have more production of crops, and therefore we can fight famine. Okay, so while on the surface that sounds fabulous, and I do want to say that this is like a very simplified understanding for us to have of this. There's so many more layers of complexities, but at the surface, right? Seeing more crops and therefore having less famine seems like a fantastic idea, right? However, the issue with the Green Revolution is that these seeds, these high yielding seeds that were essentially being used for the crop production, allow immense amount of water. There's fertilizer. So we saw that Norman Borlaug's seeds actually were on the onset of World War II, right? And what happened during World War II? Anyone have any ideas? What was one of the most produced, what was produced during World War II that we can see potentially being used for agriculture? Pesticides. Okay. What else do we think? Gases. All right, we're getting warm. Chemicals. Okay, yep. So what did we see was one of the most, what we saw, like bombs were created during World War II. And what do you need for bombs? You have a lot of nitrogen. So you've got a lot of nitrogen. You've got all these the hubs of nitrogen. So what do you do with those nitrogen plants? Well, you turn them into plants to be used for fertilizer production. Okay, so now all of a sudden we've got this American company, right, that we've got an American scientist that's backed by American companies. Can someone guess who some of the players were that supported the Green Revolution initially and supported Norman Borlaug's work? If you're in Seattle or New York, if you're in New York, you should definitely, there's one big one over there. Any ideas or guesses? So we got the Rockefeller Foundation, and currently we've got the Gates Foundation. I don't know about the Gates Foundation back in the day. That one's a little, I don't think that actually exists. That couldn't have been possible back in the day. The Gates Foundation is currently, but we've got the Rockefeller Foundation back in the day was one of the big supporters for, also Ford Foundation, yep. So all you Michiganders, we got Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and we had this American scientist essentially that was, you know, intention was good. Intention was, hey, we're going to fight famine with the ability to be able to create more crops. And this is how you do it. Now, the issue, and we see this with fair trade across the board, okay? So we see this with fair trade, is intention alone is not good enough. We have to go the next step and recognize what will be the potential results that I'm not seeing of my intentions, because great intention can do also great harm. So what we ended up seeing with the Green Revolution was essentially this, we have these high yielding seeds that are being used that require a lot of fertilizers, and you've got this immense amount of fertilizer being used, but you have no proper equipment that's being given to these farmers. These fertilizers are extremely expensive. These seeds are very expensive. What happened is, and what we're seeing is the result of the Green Revolution is an increase in cancer rates, because you have communities that have been told essentially that in order for them to self-sustain, they have to use these new types of seeds, abandon their traditional generational farming methods for new farming methods, and they are restricted to very few crops. So we see instrumentally high cancer rates because people don't have the right equipment, right? You have people using bare hands and touching chemicals. Like, we all know that that is extremely harmful. And then you've got high cancer rates, you've got immense amounts of debt. And the reason it's important to recognize that immense amount of debt is, okay, for many of us, if you run a business, right, when you are a brand and you're selling to one of your wholesale clients, you probably sell them the product at 50% of what you would sell direct to consumer. Farmers, however, are considered direct to consumer according to how this map of power exists in farming. So farmers, no matter, small farmers essentially are essentially having to buy these seeds and fertilizers and whatever their needs are in order to comply to new farming methods at full price. And they have now, if they have no guarantee of a minimum support price, they really have no idea if they will ever be able to make back what they're putting in order to produce these crops. And the reality is that farmer suicides are incredibly high because so many farmers are already in such insurmountable amounts of debt. It's really, really sad to see that essentially the system has failed the farmers, right? We have farmers who have been forced to take on these new forms of farming, who are then, as a result of complying, being put into such immense debt, having to suffer with health consequences. And for them, their only option, for many of them, that they see and feel is a suicide. And it's very sad to see that. And the Green Revolution, for us to really understand the impact of the Green Revolution, we have to recognize, so the Green Revolution in India started in Punjab. Punjab's farmers have seen what it's done to their people. It's seen what it has done to their community. And it is really a shame to see that when we're talking about these new farming bills, one of the things we have to think about in any situation, right? When we talk about global development, when we talk about economic justice, having a top down approach is the number one problem of why oftentimes intentions don't necessarily equal results, right? And so when we're talking about creating sustainable change in any one economy or any one society, we have to recognize that to create sustainable change, those who are being impacted by these laws or by these bills or by these techniques of farming are the ones who are at the table leading the conversation. So by all means, the Green Revolution, I would be really selfish to not recognize that the Green Revolution is currently happening. It's happening in Africa, and we are seeing the same. We are going to see the exact same thing happen to communities across Africa. And it's really unfortunate because the reality of the Green Revolution is that while it may have fought against famine, it created more economic disparities. It created much more. It really hurt the sustainability of communities and of agriculture, right? We saw a diversity of crops be replaced by those that complied by the Green Revolution's wheat and paddy focus, right? It's interesting. Punjab's produces so much of the rice that is used in India, but rice is not actually the primary item consumed by those living in Punjab. And so one of the things that I think is just such a critical thing to acknowledge is when we talk about creating more healthy communities, we have to talk about how communities can produce for the sustainability of their own community, right? Like, how can communities be sustainable? They have to be able to produce for themselves. And so we've seen that diversity of crops basically gone. I did a podcast episode about the Green Revolution, and one of my guests spoke about how his family farmed cauliflower one year. And basically, it was selling for so cheap that they had to throw the cauliflower onto the street side because it was cheap. It was more expensive for him to pay and himself cultivate the cauliflower than it was for him to even, he would be making, basically be making less for the cauliflower. It was more expensive to actually even cultivate the cauliflower. So to recognize this, we see this in the United States where communities are struggling to self-sustain because they've become very dependent on just a few key crops that are then used and reproduced and continue to feed the larger country. But we have to recognize that communities need to self-sustain in order for them to thrive. We cannot be continuing to benefit off of the backs of small farmers because they are the ones that are being sacrificed at the end of the day. And that's why I think that it's important to also note about the importance around global development, right? So the same person who had this amazing anecdote about the cauliflower mentioned something to me. And I think that it is just such an important aspect of how we think about fair trade in general, right? So global development, what Irvinder Singh said was that the economies of a particular country the economics of a particular country has to be grown there. If you try to import it directly from another country, those models sometimes fall flat. And I would argue most of the time fall flat. And this is why I think with fair trade, it's important to recognize that sometimes we go in with our own preconceived notions of what is right, what is wrong, how something should be and how something shouldn't be. And similarly to how we've seen the Green Revolution cannot be the methods around the Green Revolution cannot work in every single economy. We have to also recognize the bills, while they may be, this idea of a free market exists in the United States, that doesn't necessarily mean that that same cookie cutter approach is going to work in India. We have to understand that there's different nuances of power and power structures and systems and policies that really do form how a country operates and is. That's why I think, it's important to recognize that us, even me, as someone who has Punjabi heritage and whose family is from Punjab, like I myself still cannot say that I fully understand the nuance of what it means to be a farmer in Punjab. That is not my lived experience. Therefore, I cannot dictate what their policies around agriculture should be. That has to be, those conversations have to be led by that community. And the same thing goes for how we think about economic development in any country, right? Oftentimes there's this push of, well, we need to create jobs. We have to create more access to jobs, and we're going to pay people fair wages, and that's the answer. And I would argue that that is just the surface. We have to first recognize why problems exist in any given community to begin with. Why is this an issue in this community? Because chances are, as you start peeling back the layers of why an issue exists in any community, you're going to realize there's a lot more complexity there, right? My favorite example is, with sanitary napkins, we see this as, hey, you buy these pads and we're going to give pads out so that girls can start going to schools. And it's not every time is the problem the access to sanitary napkins. Sometimes the problem might be much more nuanced, and there may be cultural layers, there may be religious and political layers, right? We have to understand that there's much more to any given issue than what we see on the surface. And so, speaking to that, I want to talk a little bit about the intersections of oppression when we talk about India, right? So India is a very interesting dynamic. We see oppression take place in the form of caste, gender, religion. There's also racial oppression, but that's really influenced, I think, a lot more by some of these core aspects, by caste, religion, and gender. And we see that in particular with the case of Nodeep Kaur, who's a labor rights activist that is currently being held, and her final bail hearing keeps getting postponed, which is very unfortunate. But we see this, right? Dalit caste is considered the lowest caste according to social constructs of India. She is a female, and she is from a marginalized religious group. She is Sikh, right? So we see these different intersections and how they come together and really influence how people are oppressed in any given community, right? It's important to recognize that. And that's why it's important to also recognize that our approach to global development cannot always be the same in every community, let alone every country, right? It cannot be the same in every country, let alone every community. Nodeep Kaur's case is really important. She is a labor rights activist. She is fighting for, she basically was put behind bars, unlawfully arrested for speaking up against gender discrimination and caste-based discrimination. All right, so that's the degree of issues when it comes to human rights violations that we're seeing during the farmers' protest. Because if we don't recognize that this is what we mean when we talk about human rights violations, and her bail hearing keeps getting postponed. So it's really unfortunate to see how so much of this is happening. So I want everyone to feel like they can keep learning and keep educating themselves. I really want to encourage you, if you haven't, please tune in. I did a podcast episode, it's an hour and a half, with 4 brilliant individuals, called A Land Divided, and it breaks down the different layers of the Green Revolution. And then also, Anna from Fair World Project is here. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining. Fair World Project has been very amazing to co-champion a letter of solidarity that's been signed by quite a few brands, sustainable, ethical, impact-driven brands and organizations that are really fighting for more global justice, or advocating for global justice. So if you are a brand and would like to sign on to the letter, you can click on the link in it's artofcitizenry.com/solidarity-statement. There's an ability for you to sign on as a brand. And then if you are an individual, Anna shared a link earlier. You can also go on that same link that I just read out to you, and you can sign your name as an individual. You'll just get redirected to the page that Anna shared. So please feel free to sign on to the petition. We would really appreciate that. And so with that, please, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for taking your time and being here with me.